Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for being with us on a beautiful Thursday afternoon and a beautiful Thursday evening. My name is Jake Begard, and I have the privilege of serving as the program manager of the Common Ground Initiative here in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Doug Kinchy, and the Kauffman Interfaith Institute, thank you for being with us today, whether you're in person or joining us virtually on Zoom, YouTube, or our website. Before we jump into tonight's discussion, we're first going to hear from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy when she shares some highlights into her personal journey of leadership. Then Kyle Coyers, Associate Director of the Kauffman Interfaith Institute, will introduce our keynote speaker and moderator for this evening, Dr. Neil Carlson. Following Neil's remarks, our panelists will join him on stage for our discussion. In tonight's question and answer session, we'll be using question cards. So if you didn't see those in the back there, Abby's walking around, so please do grab those. As you write your questions, please raise your hand or your card, and a member of the Hauenstein Center staff will be around to collect those. For those of you watching virtually, simply submit your question using the Q&A functions. In discussing topics like democracy and religion, it's important to remind ourselves of how personal and wide-ranging these terms are across communities of faith, secular communities, and spiritual communities. And in doing so, it requires each one of us to take an active responsibility for ourselves and what remains in our control. To expound on that, I'd like to welcome Katie Kozak to the stage. Katie is a junior majoring in international relations with minors in Spanish and international business. Upon graduation, Katie plans to attend law school. Please help me in welcoming Katie to the stage.
Hello, my name is Katie Kozak. I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy Fellow, and I am a leader. I've always been a leader. One time, I even jumped off the front of the stage at an audition to set myself apart from the other candidates. Or have I always been bossy, outspoken, bold, and confident? Being a leader is much more than being the loudest voice in the room, the most eager, or the most confident. Through the Cook Leadership Academy's programming, I have learned what it truly means to be a leader. A leader sometimes means being the best listener, and not just listening by staying quiet, active listening, by truly reflecting and pondering the information you are being offered. New perspectives can be your greatest asset. Being a leader involves being intentional, having considered one's ethics and biases, constantly examining the world with these lenses in mind. Being a leader can mean recognizing the power and influence you hold. This sometimes means knowing how to admit one's own shortcomings. It is important to acknowledge when you are not the expert, you don't know enough, and how to learn from others effectively and graciously. Being a leader means having this team or followers that respect you enough to follow your guidance. This respect is earned and must be done so every day. One way to do this is by being an effective listener, ensuring that their contributions have value. So keeping this in mind, I invite you today to listen intentionally, using any new information to build yourselves as understanding individuals and as leaders. My name is Katie Kozak, and I am a leader.
Thank you for that, Katie. And as I get set up here, I'll just begin by being forthright with you all and stating that I am not an expert, living into that hope that she offered us as aspiring leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Kyle Coyers. I am the Associate Director of the Kauffman Interfaith Institute. On behalf of the Kauffman Institute, welcome to this Common Ground conversation on democracy and religion. We are so thrilled to be collaborating with our friends at the Hauenstein Center on this event. Thank you to Jacob and to the entire staff for all of your work in making tonight possible. And a big thank you to our moderator and to our panelists for being with us this evening to share your research, your wisdom, and your personal experiences with us. The Kauffman Institute is a unit within the Division of Inclusion and Equity here at Grand Valley State University. In promoting interfaith understanding and mutual respect, the Institute offers a broad range of programming, over 200 events and initiatives every year that seek to create a more inclusive and equitable West Michigan community for persons of diverse cultural and religious, spiritual, and secular traditions. As we begin our time together, especially because we're discussing democracy and religion on this continent, we are right in pausing to acknowledge the land on which we gather. We recognize the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples on whose land we are gathered this evening. The three fires people are indigenous to this land, which means that this is their ancestral territory. Every university, congregation, institution, business, and monument here in West Michigan is built on stolen native land. We are guests on their land, and one way to practice right relations is to develop genuine ways to acknowledge the histories and traditions of the people who originated here first, who are still here, and who tend to the land always. As we make this acknowledgement, we know it is but an important first step, and that there are many more that we need to take when we decide to engage in the important work of justice and equity. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our discussion moderator for this evening, Dr. Neil Carlson. Neil Carlson is director of the Center for Social Research at Calvin University, which is becoming DataWise Consulting LLC as of April 30th. Congratulations. Where he is founder and principal consultant. Neil received his doctorate in political science from Duke University in 2004 and delights in solving problems by linking team culture to technology. His research interests include civic engagement, organizational culture, religion and politics, diversity and inclusion, the digital transformation of society, and science and technology policy. Projects often culminate in interactive data visualizations. Dr. Carlson, thank you so much for being with us. We invite you up for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here in this beautiful location. We want to talk about democracy and religion, and the names of the panelists and myself are here, but we'll introduce them in more detail when we have the panel discussion in a few minutes. When we think about this phrase, religion and democracy, it might be helpful to broaden the scope of the topics that we think we might cover in discussing them. For example, faith and civic engagement, spirituality and political participation, congregation and community, or purpose, meaning making, and justice. And I want to acknowledge, I'm grateful that Seth Thomas Sutton can be here to stand in for Andrea Riley-Mukovitz, who challenged us in preparing for this to think about the ways that all of these dualities kind of frame things in terms that are a bit Eurocentric, that reflect the way that we have inherited to think about our world, the separation of church and state, and a variety of things like that. If we back the camera up a little bit, we might find that there's a single holistic concept here of belonging. Who belongs to our community? Why? Who decides who belongs? What do we believe is our ultimate fate as a people who belong together? Will the quality of our life together ultimately be judged by God, by nature, by future historians? Will the ultimate judge look on our work as one of creating community or of destroying it? So I want to thank Kyle and Jacob and others for teeing this up with a metaphor of a lens on democracy and religion, because that really feeds in to a metaphor that I want to ask you to play with as you open your minds to this conversation about point and counterpoint in democracy and religion. If you imagine an experience that many of us have had, I look around the room and I see a lot of people wearing lenses. You've seen this equipment that the optometrists use. Let's lean into that for a couple minutes. focus on the idea of seeing itself. If we conceive of seeing as mere eyesight, the sense that helps us step over obstacles that we might trip on and injure ourselves, then a practical and scientific approach might focus on our eyes. I might expect corrective lenses, carefully selected through trial and error, to sharpen my eyesight. But there are many other ways to see better. A genial LASIK eye surgeon I know might tease me whenever he sees me clean my glasses, reminding me that I have a more direct and permanent way to improve my vision. A neurologist might remind me that my healthy brain interpolates images, filling in a lot of apparent detail that isn't directly based on light that's currently being reflected directly onto my retina. Sleep deprivation can really mess with this functionality. The threat that I jumpily perceive in my peripheral vision might just be the ventilation moving a curtain. A pharmacist might warn me that no lens can correct for an addiction to a hallucinogenic drug. A person who's long been blind might point out that my dependence on my eyes leads me to underemphasize sound and smell and touch in ways that distort my understanding of my environment. And a Hindu mystic might urge me to open my third eye to perceive a reality beyond the physical. As the Apostle Paul says in the King James Version of 1 Corinthians 13:12, "For now we see through a glass darkly." None of these perspectives, alternatives on vision, should startle or offend us. They're all useful. So how can we take that into this conversation? Well, one common way to frame discussion of democracy and religion is to debate whether people can rightly perceive their civic duties and human rights without reference to some system of ultimate meaning, a worldview that defines virtue and vice and provides supernatural incentives to favor virtue. Perhaps our perceptions of our body politic are blurring because we are allowing our connection to godliness and sacred corporate rituals to deteriorate. Some Christian religious leaders would prescribe the body politic a sort of revivalist exercise regimen, seeking to increase attendance at religious services, encourage a return to private devotion and prayer, and so forth. Now, if our political problems, and there are many that we will discuss, are indeed analogous to blurry moral vision, and they may be, then this prescription may be correct. However, religious beliefs and revivals can also interfere with our perceptions of political reality. With all due respect to possible actual Marxist in the room, I have long been a diehard anti-Marxist when it comes to practical political economy. But it is not hard to understand why Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the people. Listen to the excellent Christianity Today podcast about the rise and fall of Mars Hill, about toxic masculinity in the Seattle megachurch. Or read Kristen Dumais' masterful book, Jesus and John Wayne, about white evangelicals' long embrace of a popular culture of toxic masculinity. Would democracy benefit from more intensely committed religiosity among its citizens? Yes, if religion facilitates love of neighbor and patience with conflict. But no, not if fresh religiosity is inspired by the rhetoric of petty tyrants like the Reverend Mark Driscoll, the disgraced hypermasculine pastor of the Mars Hill megachurch. So simple X causes Y hypotheses, religion serves democracy, for example, are often wrong because we often observe A and call it X, and observe B and call it Y. The fact that A correlates with B is not necessarily good evidence that X causes Y. Consider this recent chart from the Pew Research Center. What do your eyes see? I'll stop lecturing and just let's look at it together. You can see that in 2007, 78% of US adults said they identified with Christianity, and by 2021, it was 63%. Meanwhile, the no religion went from 16 to 29%. And then you have other religions more or less steady around 5 to 6%. Now the question is, what do you see? If you said rapidly decreasing religiosity in the American public, you're not necessarily wrong. But you are doing a bit of what our brain does when it fills in details that our eyes don't actually see. Pew's abbreviated title that I've reproduced here with all due respect to their excellent work is encouraging you in this direction to a certain degree. This chart is not a direct snapshot of decreasing religiosity. It is a visualization of Americans' decreasing self-reported religious affiliation in response to a survey question. So a more precise headline might say something like, in 2021, roughly 3 in 10 of our adult survey respondents said they had no religious affiliation. That is a precise statement. Dependence on survey research as our eye exam, as that fancy equipment, has consequences. Now, this is my profession. I'm the last person to talk down the value of survey data to you, but we have to know what to do with it. One of the things with this picture is there's detail missing. The previous chart presents a monolithic Christianity, but it's really Protestant affiliation that has declined the most, 12% out of the 15-point decline, with Catholic reports of affiliation declining only 3%. Now, these data do mean something that can't just be dismissed. There are real changes in religiosity, but we need to consider the mapping of A, what people say on a survey, onto X, what actual religiosity is. So there are some factors that Pew themselves has documented that affect self-reported disaffiliation. There's social desirability bias, and there's evidence that this is significant and that it's changing, which is to say, now compared to some years ago, all generations of American respondents to surveys feel less pressure to report affiliation than they used to. Now, that you can compare people who have the same level of religious commitment, who report the same frequency of prayer and church attendance and other forms of religious commitment, they're less likely to report affiliation at the same level now than they did before. Something has changed about how much people feel obligated to report affiliation. There's also generational replacement going on, in that the millennials are becoming the largest generation, and they have always had less self-reported religious affiliation, which may or may not have a lot to do with their actual religiosity. And then there's age effects that, even independent of generational and social desirability bias, younger people, otherwise similar to others, are more likely to report no affiliation than similarly religious older people. So given all these qualifying factors, it's at least possible that an apparently successful campaign to restore a high rate of reported affiliation would partly be restoring the social desirability bias, which is part of our political identity as a democracy, rather than affecting actual religiosity. I hope that makes sense. So I have some discussion starters here, and rather than do a traditional, I want to invite my colleagues to go ahead and start coming up to the chairs. And I have a lot of other content in reserve if this goes slowly, but I don't think it's going to. These folks are ready to talk. Rather than go through these questions one by one and run out of time, I want to pose them all now. And I'm going to invite each person to introduce themselves and sort of address the parts of these questions that make them feel motivated and passionate. So the questions are, what data about religion and democracy, qualitative or quantitative, what facts have your attention? What trends do you see? And what are some common systemic influences on the political culture of religious communities? For example, the social desirability bias thing, demographic change, these are systemic influences. What uniquely religious or communal resources do these religious communities draw on to resist or exploit these systemic influences? In other words, we have global forces like demographics, and then each community may have its own unique religious attributes that it can distinguish itself from the general current of socioeconomic change and demographic change. And then what would we forecast will happen from these trends, and what actions do you recommend taking? So I'm going to come sit down. We'll put this on, there's my favorite last slide. I want to ask Petra Al-Sufi from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding to introduce yourself, talk about what you know and how you know it, and In preparing for this, you've talked about some data about Islamic religious affiliation trends that would be informative.
Thank you, Neil. My name is Petra Al-Soufing. As mentioned, I am with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and we do research on American Muslims, hence why you didn't see the data here, because no one does that, we do that. That's why I'm here with you. Also a graduate of Grand Valley State University, studied political science and was heavily involved with the Einstein Center back in the days. So one thing to kind of bring to the conversation is what you showed here, the slides, and the decline in religiosity or religious affiliation. And as mentioned, we didn't see the data on American Muslims in the graph here, but Pew did include or showed that American Muslims were actually 20% of adult American Muslims are also not affiliating with their faith as adults, even though they grew up in Muslim households. And so we're seeing that loss, if we could say loss. But we're also seeing from our research from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding that American Muslims are seeing their faith and their religion as a very important aspect to their daily life across the board. We're seeing, the majority of American Muslims saying it's a very important aspect of who they are, their identity, and we're seeing that especially among younger American Muslims. I know you mentioned here the generational gap and younger people not identifying or not reporting. We're not seeing that with American Muslims. As a matter of fact, we're seeing 91% of American Muslims between the ages of 18 and 29, which is the same percentage as in the older, those 50 and over in the American Muslim community, say that their religion is very important to who they are. And that's definitely not the story in the general public, where only 49%. One last thing to end here, there is a commonality with American Muslims, even though younger people in the American Muslim community are attending the mosque more than their peers are attending the church. So 24% compared to 11%. From our data, we're still hearing all of our parents and grandparents and mosque leadership say, where are the younger people? So they're doing better than their peers in the general public, but it's only 24% of that demographic.
So I want to move on to introducing Seth Thomas Sutton in a second, but I want to make sure we stick a pin in and come back to talking about, so what might explain that difference between Muslim patterns and other patterns, particularly that one with youth?
Yeah, well, I mean, the religious identity, especially here in the American context, where that faith community have been under, I guess, the microscope for the last 20 years, if we could just stick to the last 20 years that have been before, but especially in the last 20 years, where it's very hard for people to, to disassociate from their religious identity because it was everywhere. We're only 1% of the population, but if you're watching the news and you're reading the stories, you think we're 50%. So it was an opportunity for American Muslims to either embrace their identity even with the challenges, like the fact that 60% of American Muslims report experiencing religious discrimination consistently over the last 5 years, or you're dealing with the identity issues. Like, what else are you going to do, especially if that's how people associate you? But at the same time, it's not just the only choice. It's a matter of people are actually seeing their faith as a source of happiness, as a source of finding purpose. And there's a whole lot that we'll get into later, but the research shows that the connection between connecting to your faith is linked to, civic engagement, to doing better, and, being a protective factor from, mental health issues and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Yep.
Seth Thomas Sutton from Montcalm Community College. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. So ani buju na newe maganrak maing ani but ndejnakas maing dodem nin dao North Shore Band Waganak Singo Dawak Nundunjaba Nimazanak Kazan, Montcalm Gabe Gakin Ladas Wagamik Nongom. So Apajigo Miguech Bizendawiyeg. So it is an Anishinaabeg protocol greeting that I greet you in our traditional languages. There's a few things that I said within that greeting. First, I said, hello, all my relatives, because we are all related. We are all beings of the earth. We're all creations of the earth. So in that way, we are all related spiritually. So I address you as my relatives. I identify my name. My Anishinaabe name is Maingananiwik, which is Standing Wolf. My clan affiliation, which is Maingadodem, Wolf Clan. And then I had said my traditional territory, which is the Waganok Singwadaak Ndunjaba, which is the North Shore Band of Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. So, and then I also said that currently I am faculty and chair of the Arts and Humanities Department at Montcalm Community College. And thank you all so much for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. So the one interesting thing that I have to say is that we make up 2% of the population. That said, though, there is an amazing trend with our young people in our Indigenous communities who are really taking up the banner of relearning traditional ways, and in particular, through practical and everyday means. Food sovereignty is a thing that we practice, contemporarily, and it's really refreshing. But there is no separation between spiritual identity and physical identity. The idea of, for example, the word, and it's anglicized, we would say Chippewa, right, or Ojibwa, Ojibwe. If you break that word down, O, and then Jibe is literally our word for spirit, right? It's our soul. And then the Bay part is the human form. So when you say, or when you identify as Ojibwe, you are literally saying, I'm a spirit in human form. So there is no separation between this idea of a religion or dogmatic kind of doctrine that we follow. It is a moral obligation to always be spiritual and always put the community before yourself. So it's a different experience that I hope to bring to this in this table tonight, but a different perspective and lens. That's a most eloquent way of saying it, because there are, I think, ways that we can blend some of these ideas together. But it is really refreshing to see the Indigenous communities, to see the amount of engagement that the youth are taking up. And they're taking personal responsibility, and that's hopefully something we can get into tonight. But the idea that they're taking responsibility for their spiritual being, on this planet and on this within this perceptual reality, and it's a moral obligation to be the best human being that we possibly can. So I don't have numbers. I'm a philosopher, critical thinker, critical theorist, right? Math, to me, 2 + 2 is green, if that makes sense. So, I work in the communities and with the community, and I just see the people. That's what I want,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Scott. I want to turn to Matt Jansen from Hope College, who works in ethnic studies. And I'm wondering if there's an involving connection just in when we frame talk about how religion and democracy go together, if we think about the fact that democracy is not just to facilitate majority rule, but also to protect minority rights. And so talking about a couple groups that are 1% and 2% of the population is essential to understanding what our polity is. And I think you might bring another perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. As Neil said, my name is Matt Jansen. I teach at Hope College. I teach ethnic studies and religious studies. I've been in West Michigan for the last 3.5 years now. Before that, spent about a decade in North Carolina, and grew up in Vermont. So I'm not anything like from West Michigan, but I'm finding my way slowly but surely, and learning all the strange ways people spell their Dutch last names in Holland, Michigan, where I now live. In addition to my work, which is roughly in the area of religion, race, and democracy, I come at these questions from a bit of a practical perspective. When I was in graduate school in Durham, North Carolina, I got involved with a tradition of small d democratic practice, which is called broad-based organizing, with a group called the Industrial Areas Foundation. A radically democratic movement that grew out of 1930s, 1940s Chicago, led by a secular Jew named Saul Alinsky, which just about everybody seems to have something they really don't like about Saul Alinsky, so perhaps he was onto something. The Industrial Areas Foundation is a network of about 60 to 70 local independent power building organizations that organize civil society institutions to build power among ordinary people, crossing lines that normally divide us so that ordinary people have the power to address issues for themselves. The iron rule of organizing in this tradition is never do for others what they can do for themselves. And so it's a real emphasis on building power at the local level so that these forces, whether they be market forces or state forces which dominate our lives, are able to be pushed back against by ordinary people working together. I think one thing that strikes me about these questions is the need to frame them perhaps in a bit of a wider lens. With my students at Hope College right now, we've been reading a lot by two really important members of the history of our state of Michigan, Jimmy Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs. If you don't know about the Boggs and the Boggs Center in Detroit, I would encourage you to check it out and to maybe read Grace Lee Boggs' book, The Next American Revolution. Grace Lee Boggs liked to ask a question, which is, what time is it on the clock of the world? And her point was that if we want to make sense of things like the demographic trends we're seeing or these sort of data points we've just discussed a little bit, we have to know where we're at in history. What is going on? Are we living in a golden age? Are we living at a time of crisis? Is it 410 and the Visigoths have just sacked Rome? Where are we in history? And I think from my perspective, we're in a time of profound crisis because a project, call it what you want, I tend to call it racial capitalism for short, that has been pursued for the better part of 500 years, has run its course. And its inability to ensure the flourishing of humanity and the planet is radically in question. And so I think the questions I would want to ask to root this conversation is, if we think about our democracy maybe as a form of statecraft or religion and sort of institutional affiliation, sorts of statistics we've just been discussing, I think the telling question is, what do these institutions, be they our political institutions or our religious institutions, have to say to the profound crises that we are facing? And on the one hand, these crises are sort of can seem big and elusive, systemic racism or climate change. But on the other hand, these crises are myriad and they are experienced by ordinary people every day in so many ways, be it through unaffordable housing, children suffering from lead poisoning, undocumented people and their families being terrorized by ICE. Every day, these things are happening in my community of Holland, Michigan. And I'm not a social scientist and I don't collect data on it, but what I do is organize. And that organizing takes the work of meeting with people and hearing their stories and connecting them with other people who share similar stories. For me, the question of the future of religion and democracy in the United States has everything to do with whether we are willing to disengage from a bankrupt project of racial capitalism and find new, radically democratic ways of building local power in ordinary people's lives so that they can be the agents to address the problems that are facing themselves. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Hopefully that gives us some things to talk about.
Kevin Mcintosh from the One America movement, do you find something to jump off of from the previous speakers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so excited to be here with you all. I'm Kevin Mcintosh. I'm with the One America movement. The One America movement's mission is to connect people across differences to push back against toxic polarization. So one thing I think about as we think about religion and democracy, I hear often that we're so polarized. The country is polarized. It's the word of the day, it feels like sometimes. And polarization can sometimes be really good. Polarization allows us to get really creative ideas on the table. Disagreements are okay. When it gets bad is when it becomes toxic. It becomes this difference between I don't like your idea versus I don't like you because of your idea. I think that differential is really important. And so in our work, we work with religious leaders to help think through how can you create spaces in your church, in your synagogue, in your temple, in your mosque, where we can create norms to be okay with disagreement, but not be okay with hating each other because of that disagreement. So when we get to a point when we can't work together, when I'm not willing to work with you because we vote differently, or we look differently, or we pray differently, that's when the democracy stops. That's when we can't solve the local issues, when we can't solve the bigger issues. We have work in West Virginia where we are working with local churches and local synagogues to work against the opioid epidemic that's happening, and coming together in local communities, whether it's Grand Rapids or Jackson, Mississippi, Chicago, Danville, Charlottesville, to bring people across those divides, to say we can work together. We vote differently, we believe differently, we might think very differently about these issues, but why opioids are here, why kids go hungry at night, why climate change is happening, but we can still come together despite those differences to work on that project together. So once that stops happening, to me, that's when the democracy falls apart.
It's a great connection to the common ground theme.
Absolutely.
For this conversation. So coming up on, I believe, May 6th, I've been invited to talk to the Council of Delegates of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. That's a big part of the community here in Grand Rapids in West Michigan. And there's concern about declining membership in the denomination. It peaked out in the early 1990s and has fallen now to the low 200,000s, where it was nearing 300,000 at one time. And this is a political question, right? One of the things I like about the Reformed tradition is it's political. We have a body that makes decisions in a democratic fashion called the Synod. And the Synod has to consider how they're going to respond to this. One of the claims is that the peak in the early 1990s, the reason for the fall in membership following that is that there was a controversy about women being accepted into ministry. And that's why people left. And there was a marked exodus of the United Reformed Church from the Christian Reformed Church at that time. But if you look at the ratio of children to adults over the entire period from the 1960s to the present, there's been a steady decline in the ratio of children to adults, going all the way back. The last year that it increased was 1962, and then it's fallen from 0.9 children per adult to 0.3 children per adult. And this is to tee up the question that I was asking. This is what I would call a systemic effect, right? That the baby boom, which is much bigger than the Christian Reformed Church or any local congregation, has affected the way people perceive the life and thriving of their religious tradition, and it's affected the debate about what we should do as a group. There's a pattern of trying to blame individual pastors for membership loss in a given congregation, when in fact they have nothing to do with it. It's the whole neighborhood's been evacuated of the professionals that founded the church, and it's a completely different demographic. So I want to ask you all, do you see similar patterns where big socioeconomic and demographic trends explain more about changes in religiosity and demographic practice than do, say, specific explanations around religious doctrine or practice, or even the group that you work with or represent? I'm wondering if you have a parallel story about how an organization or group is coping with the forces. I think you've already presaged this a bit, Matt, with talking about affordable housing, for example. I think that's actually a narrative for my home congregation. People can't afford to live there anymore, who used to be part of the congregation. Does this question ring a bell with you guys yet?
For me, it does in a different way. Because what I'm seeing is, well, go back a little bit. So the American Muslim community is a very diverse community. It's the most ethnically diverse faith community in the US. You know, can't compare any other faith community, and we survey not only American Muslims, but we do compare them to other faith communities, including Jews, Protestants, Catholic, general public, and non-affiliate. And you see among American Muslims, you have, 28% that are African American, and then you have, white, Arab, Asian, Hispanic and Latino, Native American. So we got everyone. Right, so we have a very mixed, so it's, in a sense, it's kind of like the American story in a very tiny community. We have 50% that are immigrant, and then 50% that are native born. So there's a lot to unpack here, but one thing that's, using my own background as someone who come from an immigrant background, one thing that I see is, social mobility allowing people to move from one community to another. And so you see the popping up of new mosques all over the country. On the other hand, what goes with it is that fear. So here you have a minority community that's very, very small community. It seems like it's growing, but even if it's growing, it's still 1%. But in every community, there is a move. The threat seems to that local community, it feels real. Here's a mosque replacing the church. That building used to be a church. Now it's literally bought out and it's transferred into a mosque. So where I'm going with this is the use of, I guess, what some of us from the liberal art background who grew up learning this is just the American story, what it's translating on the ground in local communities is as this fear of a minority community and of minority communities in general. This is something that we have a habit of doing in this country, of overestimating minority communities, and it often goes hand in hand with just painting that with a fearful picture. And then on the other hand, you also have gentrification, which is happening to historically African American neighborhoods, including African American Muslim neighborhoods. So yes, you have that part of the story too, where we released a study on called the Mosque Survey, U.S. Mosque Survey. You could access all of that on our website and learn everything you want and do not want about American mosques. But one thing that was interesting was while the number of mosques is increasing in the country from the last 10 decades, African American mosques are declining. And so this is something that we're trying to dig a little bit deeper into and see what is that story, but definitely gentrification is part of that narrative. So I hope that answered a little bit.
Well, and let's put a connection together. That I wonder whether the same thing that has happened to the Dutch Reform community, which is that the wave of immigration that fed the sense of vitality and energy has dried up. We've succeeded in becoming wealthy and educated, which means fewer children per family, which means fewer baptisms and smaller churches. And the question is, if the Muslim community in 50 years, without a steady flow of new immigration, might experience the same process of aging and becoming prosperous and getting educated and having fewer children and then feeling a kind of dry. That's the systemic influence I'm talking about.
Right.
And part of the question is, what do you see that people can use to mobilize to resist forces like that, or to turn them to advantage in some way?
Yeah, I mean, so in 50 years we might. The reality is American Muslims are still having more children than other faith communities, so we're not worried about that yet. But there are other factors, like gentrification, which is definitely impacting, African American neighborhoods in others, and just the fact that, or in immigration, restriction of immigrants coming to this country. I mean, that's a reality and that's a fact, and that's impacting, not just the whole country, but obviously included in that is the American Muslim community.
Well, if I may jump in, so a couple things. One is I'm only one human being, right? I don't claim to speak or speak for any other group or any other body except for my own body. So what I will say, though, from an indigenous point of view, democracy has not been our friend. So it's really difficult to, there are things that are obviously a positive, positive attributes. But by and large, the policies that we've had to endure have been specifically made to either exclude indigenous populations completely, but more specifically and more poignantly, policies are made to exterminate, our population. And to think that maybe in 2022, genocide isn't happening, colonization is over. We tend to kind of think that within contemporary society, we have this thing in grad school called Post-Colonial Theory, right? And the idea that word post is supposed to mean that we're after colonization, right? And we're not after, we're still very much in colonization. It has just changed. So let's talk, maybe call it neo-colonization. But we have blood quantum laws, right? That no other population in this country has to deal with, and has specific governmental policies to state who can and who cannot claim certain identities. So then you start to, and it's very, very methodical. I mean, they spoke about this during the Allotment Act. We call it the Dawes Act now. I mean, it was very methodical. They knew exactly what they were doing. By 2056, the way that policies are written, so these ideas of treaties and reservation and trust lands, really, so they state with the caveat that as long as there are descendant or lineal members that fulfill the federal government standards of what it is to be a Native American, right? And I air quote, because we don't call ourselves Native American. But by a certain year, when there are no more living descendants who are able to qualify for a certain blood quantum standard, reservations, treaties are null and void. Reservation goes back into public holding, right? So now government can sell reserved treaty lands to corporations and private real estate developers, so on and so forth. So at that point, the idea that President Jackson was really going for with this whole assimilation process, it will be complete. It will come to an inevitable conclusion. So we're aware of that in our communities. And I think so we have, if you're interested in reading theory stuff, White Earth tribal member, Gerald Visner, Uncle Jerry, we have this term, survivance, and it's this amalgamation of survival and resistance, right? And that's our story. That's what we need to do. And the way that we can resist is by surviving. Our physical act of being here is the resistance against this democratic policies, or these democratic policies in this democratic state, who really do not have our best interest, and quite frankly, none of your best interests at heart, So that's what we do. Our community focuses on traditional languages, again, traditional foods, right? Because our elders are dying off, and these knowledge keepers that speak, there's very few people that speak Anishinaabe, right? It's getting obviously much more diverse now, and we're taking it upon ourselves to relearn these traditions, and that's our survival, that's our resistance.
I want to reinforce what you're saying by pointing out that when you say the reservations would go back to public, the public itself is defined by political institutions that exclude
absolutely
Native Americans, indigenous peoples.
Fair
and
enough.
I want to remind everyone the idea of a republic That is a Latin phrase that means the public thing, right? The reification of what the public is. So one way to talk about this whole topic space is, what do our religious traditions tell us is a legitimate reification of the public? How can we represent the public? And I wonder if we can take what you've just talked about, which is, I knew it, but I didn't know it, right? And it's shocking to hear it face to face. Because I've been talking blithely about demographics in a community that has privilege and voluntary fertility rates, right? And you're describing a situation where your fertility rates and how you define yourselves is a matter of life and death under policy.
Sure,
right?
Absolutely. Because you can't, you have to make choices. So if you marry if you are a certain blood quantum or, lower, if you marry outside, outside of your nation, case in point, one of my very good friends, their children, even though she's a tribal member, enrolled tribal member, as is her, ex-husband, but their 4 children are not tribal members because the 2 of them did not satisfy the blood quantum enough to have their offspring satisfy the governmental standards. So, but does that make them not indigenous? No, that's an asinine, absurd question. Of course they are, right? They're human beings and they're of their parents. So, they're really warped and twisted questions that they cause a lot of problems, because how do you define that? How do you talk about that when, people don't quite understand what's going on? And they're like, well, what's blood quantum? It's like, it's a bunch of math. Lots of math that doesn't actually, yes, green. Exactly. It's green. It doesn't make sense, but but how, why is it that this community has to be defined federally, right? But no one else. Right? And then you have questions of, so you have tribal members who, they've been reformed, of course, and now most traditional tribal governments are modeled after, the United States. So we now have casinos on some reservations, not all, of course, and that's a myth that a lot of people, conflate. But some that do have an amazing wealth discrepancy between the tribal enrolled members and then the ones that are not, because they're not federally qualified. So they have no benefits, they have no access to funds. They're just kind of left out on the open,
So let's connect this conversation back to the idea you were expressing, Kevin, about, I hear in what Seth Thomas is saying that an opportunity for other faith traditions to come together to repair this social policy and redeem it. Much as you were saying, there's common ground around things like criminal justice reform or affordable housing, as Matt has mentioned. Does this connect to theme for you?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking is why are these things so easy to do? Why do we sometimes think we can't work with the other side? And we think a lot that we don't know what the other side believes. So in our work, we work with a research company called Beyond Conflict or More in Common, who they're great. If you need some good research numbers, those 2 are really just great resources. They ask folks on the political spectrum, if you're a Republican, they asked you what you thought Democrats would say about this question. On a scale of 0 to 100, how open do you think the US border should be? And they did the same thing with Democrats. What do you think a Republican would say? They were so far apart. Republicans thought Democrats wanted to be about 100, and Democrats thought Republicans wanted it to be 0. There's about like a 70% gap there. Really not much space to work together, if that's what we think. In reality, when Democrats got asked what they thought and Republicans got asked what they thought, the numbers were much closer. They're about a 30-point difference. Again, not overlapping. We're not saying that Republicans and Democrats think the same on that really big issue, but there's room for nuance and room for discussion, room for conversation, and room to come together to work on immigration. This is true. More in Common has shown that this is true on almost every single hot topic political issue right now. But we don't know that because we're siloed. And when we think of Republicans or when we think of Democrats, we think of the people who we see on TV. We think of the most extreme voices. And we do that also with religions. We do that with traditions. We do that with almost everything. And what's interesting about this, to me, being at a college, is that college-educated Democrats are more likely to do that with Republicans. And we think the reason for that is because they just don't have as many Republican friends. And it's because you're friends with people in your bubble. And so those folks who believe like you, vote like you, those are going to be people you know, those are people you talk to more. So One America, we're working directly with our evangelical conservative religious groups to say, hey, let's get you into this work. Let's get you to have these conversations. So we can bring down those perception gaps, so we can get people to actually know who their neighbors are, so we can come together and work on these issues that divide us.
So before we open up to questions, which we want to do by 8 o'clock, I want to seize on this third question about religious resources, and particularly point to, when I hear what you've been saying about the experience of Muslim communities and indigenous communities, that I want my fellow co-religionists to be reminded of the Good Samaritan and of the Golden Rule, right? And that we should put ourselves in your shoes and make policy that we would want to live under if we were you. There's a Rawlsian liberal justice aspect to that goes all the way back to the New Testament, I would argue. And that's a resource that I could call on. I wonder, Matt, if you have thoughts about like religious resources that you would call upon in IAF work to mobilize and empower communities to address trends and take action to deal with things.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I mean, I think, again, what we're trying to do in the industrial areas foundation is small d democratic politics, which is meeting people where they're at in the institutions that they're already a part of. To me, the whole question of like mobilizing religious resources it's a little bit abstract to be helpful. Yeah, there are communities that we work with who are broadly recognizable as religious traditions. There are secular communities we work with. The goal is not simply to help everybody talk about, each other's differences and pat each other on the back and say we're all the same after all. The goal is to build shared self-interest across lines of difference. And the purpose is to build power, because right now our lives are dominated by state and market forces that make life very difficult for huge numbers of ordinary people in our communities. And the goal is not just shared understanding. The goal is to change society. I was struck by the theme of survival that's come up a few times. The CRC is right to be worried about its survival, but it should be more worried because there's a deeper question, which is humanity. Is humanity going to survive? Not is the CRC going to survive? And this is a question that indigenous communities, it's not a question for them. It's the reality that they're living. It's the question, though, is how long until it catches up with those of us who have for a long time pretended like that was not a question that was facing us because we were living off of inflicting that on other people. I think about Lake Mcintosh, which is, my house is a few blocks from Lake Mcintosh in Holland, Michigan. For many thousands of years, that body of water was a vital source of life for everyone who lived around it, human and non-human. It's taken a matter of decades for the dominant population to completely destroy Lake Mcintosh, so that now my children, if I don't watch them and they wander a few blocks from my house and they drink the water, there's a great chance they could become seriously ill. Lake Mcintosh is a metaphor and a warning about what we're doing to the entire planet. And the question is, will we stop and find ways to walk it back before it is too late? Because otherwise, many of us will not survive. I think when answering these questions, it then becomes interesting to realize that there are people who are thinking very carefully about how to survive in the face of cultural devastation and the complete erasure of your way of life and the land to which it is linked. I think it is interesting to think about what we might have to learn from conversations with indigenous communities before it is too late to save any of us.
Matt, when you mentioned building power, what does that look like? What are some practical, observable implications of building power?
Power comes in two forms: organized money and organized people. We all know how organized money works with power. You can see their names written on the buildings all over this campus and across West Michigan. The question is whether enough organized people with a little bit of organized money can generate the power to push back against the power of organized money to dominate our lives. So we organize people and a little bit of money to try to push back against the power of organized money to dominate our society.
Thank you.
If I could just
Yes, please.
quickly follow up on that. I think there is a connection between what they both talked about. And with the American Muslim community, there is a survival mode in a different way. Obviously, nothing close to what you described, which just give me chills. But for a very long time, it's a community that was and it still is profiled, looked at through a security lens. Interesting story. On my way here this morning, I wanted to go send money to a relative who needs it. And I found out my Western Union account was blocked. Why? I don't know. I will not be able to find out. And I'm not the only one. There are literally thousands of people like me just because of our names and our religious affiliation. The thing is, when policies like this happen, whether it's on the individual level or spying on mosques or infiltrating or profiling, which I know you probably hear these things and you're like, whatever, but it is impacting real people, everyday experiences. They don't attach a religious identity to any of these policies. There's no religious identity attached to obstructing mosques from being built. Because you know what, that's a very easy court case to win. There's no case to it. What that means is today it's the mosque that's being opposed, tomorrow it's another religious institution. So that's one thing. The other thing about the American Muslim community is it's a very diverse community, even politically. So historically it used to be a Republican community or follow the Republican Party. And now our recent data show only 11% of American Muslims identify as Republicans, 42 identify as independent, and the rest identify as Democrats. So that's how they vote. But when you look at social issues, you get everything. You have a majority that are supportive of Black Lives Matter or building coalition with Black Lives Matter. You have a split, like around a 50% split when it comes to when it comes to pro-life, when it comes to building coalition with pro-life activists, or building coalition with political conservative when it comes to religious liberty. And then you have support for LGBT. So the reason I'm saying this is looking, the survival part of it is, there are real threats and real issues that are facing the community. But what's the younger generation doing? They're not living like most of us did in the last 20 years where we're in defense mode. They're organizing now, They're organizing behind issues that matter to them and to their communities. And those communities could be Muslim communities, it could be larger communities. They're organizing behind environmental causes, they're organizing behind, affordable housing, healthcare issues, but they're also organizing behind, just decolonizing their own experience as American Muslims, but also as part of, global citizens impacted by policies and issues that not only impact them today, but impact people they care about all over the world. And that's part of who they are. So there is a lesson there, that if we don't wake up today, we might not like, the reality that we'll be in tomorrow, which is the devastating environmental disaster that we'll be in. But also just, when we look at religious minority communities, realize that their own experience have pushed them to, to really use those experiences to fight for the common good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some questions here. I believe everyone's now been alerted to the availability of question cards, but if you want one, raise your hand and it'll be brought to you. This question is, are people, according to our work and our awareness, identifying more religiously with religion or with political affiliation these days? Which is the more potent identity engine, would you say, in your experience?
I could take that.
Yeah.
So by the way, I'm not a researcher. I have a liberal art background, but I do talk about data because that's our work. So from our studies at the American, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, we find American Muslims, the stronger their religious identity, the stronger their American identity. So that there is a direct link there. And so they don't see a contradiction or a conflict between the two. But I would say from just observing people and especially the younger generation, a lot of people are dissatisfied with politics. They're not seeing who, especially as it is now. We're not seeing those who speak on our behalf, those who are representing us. People are more concerned about specific issues. And I would say the identity, the religious identity would come in first, but there's a direct link.
I'm guessing that this question is partly interested in partisan identity. You mentioned that there's the diversity within the Muslim community.
Yes.
Does discontent with how politics is working increase partisan affiliation or decrease it?
I'm going to guess decrease it because like I mentioned, it used to be, now we're seeing 42% independent.
Mm-hmm.
That's
a disillusionment.
There's a delusion, and there is a consistent 15% who just will not vote, period, even though they're, consistently. And their reason is there's no one that represents our views. Our vote will not matter. So even though the majority are kind of shifting between Republican, Democrat, Independent, things like that, but there's a consistent 15% that's saying it really doesn't matter.
I have a question teed up that I think is going to be a Matt and Seth special, so I want to ask Kevin if you want to weigh in further on that question.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this more and more. And Jesus and John Wayne, I've only read the first 2 chapters so far, but she has a great line in there that are some of the folks who voted for Trump, are they Republicans who go to church, or are they Christians who happen to vote Republican? That's made me think a lot recently. We talk a lot about our superordinate identity. So we have a group called Matthew 5:9, which is a bunch of conservative evangelical pastors who, Matthew 5:9, blessed be the peacemakers, have pledged to be peacemakers, have pledged to not let the partisan hate that can really easily come up out of elections that got formed in 2020 to happen. And so we try to tap into that religious. How can we say our faiths in most contexts calls us to be the best version of ourselves? How can we tap into that? How can we tap into that religious side to be peacemakers, to call for justice, to call for recognizing the humanity in one another? So I hope that religious side, whether you're spiritual, religious, secular, comes out, your identity around religion comes out more than partisanship. I don't always know the answer, though, to which one it is.
I want to say to the question asker that I can't give you the citation or remember the exact details, but my sense is there's some modest evidence of attraction of previously politically and religiously apathetic people into the Republican Party and into evangelical self-identification by the populist movement that elected Donald J. Trump. It's not a big move, but there is some evidence of that. And I see it in my own family, that folks who would not have engaged in Jesus talk now do. Let me ask another question here. And this one was posed to you, Matt, and I think I'd love to hear Seth's thoughts on this as well. Should Grand Rapids religious leaders take a stand on perceived racism in policing in Grand Rapids?
Yes.
I think you probably have more to say than that, though.
I mean, I'm not quite sure that I have that much more to say about it. If there's need for too much explanation, I'm a little bit at a loss. what more is there to say? If you are a religious leader in Grand Rapids and you have nothing to say about the killing of Patrick Lyoya, I mean, retire, find somebody who will, and give them your pulpit or whatever you preach from. Look, I'll speak, I guess, for a moment as a confessional Christian, member of the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. If you don't understand the way that Jesus, in his death on the cross, is radically identified with the suffering of African Americans under a white supremacist system in the United States, you don't know Jesus. Jesus was a oppressed member of a occupied community and an ethnic minority in the ancient Near East. I mean, read Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited on this, and then go ahead and read James Cone, everything he ever wrote.
Which you have read.
I have read a lot of what James Cone wrote. If Christians in the United States do not have something to say about racial justice, I can only assume it is because they have completely lost touch with the man Jesus of Nazareth, whom they claim to worship as Lord and King. I'll maybe pause there.
Right. Wow, really? You want me to talk on that? I can't follow that up. Well, okay, so maybe this is how I'll answer this one. And it kind of goes maybe a little bit about taking personal responsibility from, okay, so yeah, I mean, I can't just, yes, that's a blanket, yeah. It's not a, it's just a difficult question to answer because it's so convoluted and it shouldn't be. But at the same time, I think that we all as human beings have a moral obligation to take personal responsibility. I think that's what it is, because it's easy to point the finger and blame people for being the bad guys, but it's really not enough, right? We only let the bad guys get away with what they get away with because we don't take responsibility. You know, we don't take responsibility for our thoughts, our words, our actions, our apathy, you know? So once we, and I don't know what that would look like, and I don't know how this would happen, but once the human race takes spiritual responsibility for themselves, then I think we can start to use our intelligence the way the Creator gave it to us to use to solve these problems. And if we were truly using our intelligence intelligently and coherently, this type of incident or these types of incidences wouldn't happen. I don't know if that's something that you can write in stone. I don't know, you know, but it just seems to me that the idea that we've lost touch or people have lost touch, and if it's not Jesus who they follow, you know, lost touch with what it means to be a human being, right, and to have empathy.
That's maybe a great way to. We have a couple of folks who want us maybe to return back to the basics and get some definitions on the table of what is religion and what is democracy. I want to encourage you to answer that not in a dry dictionary method, but in a way that reflects and sums up some of the thoughts that you offer here. Like what makes for a functioning democracy? I'm hearing you say in part, like part of what I heard you say, Matt, is nothing sacred? Do you not see the image of God in your fellow human being? And will you not protect their rights? And isn't that what democracy is? Like to recognize every citizen as someone who's worthy of respect and whose input to decisions should be observed and responded to. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, for me, when I think about the word democracy, again, I always want to make that a little d, democracy, we tend to think about democracy, and it's a big D, and we tend to think of it as statecraft. Elections and campaign finance and advertisements and lawn signs and voting, those are all forms of democracy as statecraft. But I think a more expansive conception of democracy and even of politics is to see that politics is more than statecraft. Politics is the myriad complex interactions that we have as we seek to build a life with those who are different from us but share, whether it's a common place or whatever the sort of political unit of demarcation might be, right? Democratic politics is the negotiation of a common life in the midst of the differences, the conflicts, the challenges that come up across those people sharing that life. Now, that is something that we do in our religious institutions. We do it in our workplaces. We do it in our neighborhoods when the undergraduates won't turn down their music and my children are sleeping. That's politics. And I have some choices with those undergrads. I can grab a baseball bat and go next door, right? Which is, you know, when it's 2 a.m., that's maybe my first inclination as a sleeping father who knows his kids are about to be woken up. But the alternative is that we can exercise not violence and coercion, but politics. We can figure out how to build a common life. We have different interests. We want different things. They don't care that my children are trying to sleep. 2 a.m. is their favorite hour of the whole 24-hour cycle. We have to figure out how do we conciliate this? How do we build a common life here? And democratic politics is the commitment to do that in a way that honors the agency and dignity of ordinary people and says it's not something that gets passed from the top down, but is something that grows from the bottom up as ordinary people realize their own capacities and agency to create the kinds of common life and the kind of change to tackle the problems that they're facing so that they don't have to receive it from philanthropic donation from the market and those who have made a lot of money, or from handouts from the state and a liberal welfare state that simply doles out money and creates people who are victims. Again, it cuts both ways. I'm not trying to be partisan or irritate anybody more than I'm trying to irritate anybody else. But it is this profound and robust commitment to building a common life in the face of differences, diversity, and challenges in a way that prioritizes the agency and dignity of ordinary people being active members of that common life building project. That's how I define democratic politics.
I would agree with him 100%, and I would add the only addition is part of that process is the relationship between the state and the individuals, negotiating that contract and protecting the rights of minority. Again, one day it might be one group, but tomorrow is another. So how do we protect minority in an institution or in a society that agreed on a contract? And again, that's a state to individuals, but it could also apply to institutions, neighborhood, you name it.
You know, you remind me very briefly, how many have read N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy, science fiction? Anyone?
You got one.
All right, excellent. Way to go.
She's the winner.
One of the ultimate moments in all of science fiction literature, the heroine says to a group of people, no voting on who gets to be people. Mm-hmm. That's democracy, I think, in some ways. Anyone want to take a shot at the religious side of the equation?
I'll take the religion a little bit. When I used to do Interfaith 101 presentations, I would put up a slide of me asking Siri, because that's who I ask a lot for definitions, but what is the definition of religion? And Siri gives like a giant paragraph of it. I usually go with, there's a YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast. And they talk about the 3 B's of religion: belief, belonging, and behavior. It's not a checklist. It's not if one has, but there's an argument that can be made, and my dad might make this argument, that Sunday in Foxborough at a Patriots game during the fall could be a religious experience for some people. You could go to a football game, you go to a baseball game, that could be a religious experience. You have the behavior, you have the belonging. There's also the belief part, but it's not just that, right? You need all 3 of these in some way. Because if it's just belief and you have questions about birth control, or you have questions about the belief of the presence of God, and you see Christians or for the birth control, or Jewish folks for the presence of God, may disagree with what the official belief structure would say. You have behavior. Do you go to church every Sunday? Do you go to the synagogue? Do you go to mosque? It could also be just the community. Do you feel at home when you're at a Longar meal for 6, or when you're at a Passover Seder or a Ramadan Iftar? Are you at home with your people? Do you have that belonging? Do you have community there? So I think it's a mixture of those three. Again, it's not a checklist, but it's a mixture of the belief, the belonging, and the behavior for is what I would say is religion.
I guess I'm going to go in a different direction. I guess I kind of come to the understanding we have a religious perception of reality was replaced a spiritual perception of reality, and somewhere along the line of this evolution of this religious perception of reality, we collectively decided that, or they collectively decided that the earth was the dominion of man to be subdued and to, to control. From my understanding, or just the way I think, the spiritual perception of reality is we're all connected. It's that empathy, right? We have the same, liquids, minerals, and metals in our body that a tree does. Maybe this sounds a little out there for some people, but the idea of sentient beings, or this idea that trees talk, people talk to plants, that sounds funny to a lot of people, and especially if they're unfamiliar with traditional ways of maybe praying, or giving thanks or offering thanks. But I don't go with the idea of religion. I just, I can't, it's too limiting for me personally to put it into some sort of context or a box. I don't know. I just don't know what it is. I think I know what it means to be spiritual and to have reverence, to respect my intelligence, respect the gifts that I was given, to try to be the best human being. And I know this sounds cliche. It's like, oh, well, we're not perfect. I understand that. But I don't know. I don't know what religion is. It seems to me very much a set of rules and a structure.
There's a fourth B, bureaucratization.
Okay, thank you. There's some really things. Okay, so I don't ever want to say anything to offend any of you. That's not what I'm about. But I have different perspectives, and sometimes those challenge mainstream ideologies hardcore, right? And very bluntly, I don't go with religion. I think it's too limiting. And I think it is meant, my idea of what a democracy, I think that democracy isn't broken. I think the democracy that we have in the United States is running exactly the way they intended it, and it's doing exactly what they wanted, which is the idea of repression of people into a working subjugated class, while the industrial ruling elite benefit off the laborers. And I think that's exactly what democracy was meant to do, and it's exactly what it's doing currently. Excuse me, and all we're doing is perpetuating that system. Having conversation, and okay, so this sounds very, pessimistic. These conversations are great to have. We need these conversations, right? Because the more people that we can enlighten, or at least open up their perspectives and understand, like, there are diverse opinions and voices, and it doesn't have to be in a square box, right? There's a multitude of perspectives, and once we understand what it truly means to be you know, have the being part of human. You know, I mean, we act through the human, but we feel through the being, right? That's how we should, I think, perceive our reality. So that's where I'm at on that. I don't know if that necessarily answers anybody's question, specifically on what my ideologies are of religion or spirituality, but it is, again, taking personal responsibility and understanding that I'm no different than anything else. And it's not the pat on the back, we're all the same. I get that. But it is, but what happens to the earth happens to us, plain and simple.
I hear an echo of a famous remark of C.S. Lewis, who said, prayer doesn't change God, it changes me.
Yeah.
And in a way, you might say prayer doesn't change nature, but it changes me.
Right.
Holds me accountable.
Sure, absolutely, right? Because if we don't take responsibility, then we're just pretending. We're playing human. You know, we're playing being, and that doesn't do anything. I don't know if there's any ways out of any of the conversations that we've had. I don't know if there's a social or political way out of where we're at. I really don't know. I'm not an advocate for you know, a coup, you know, for the United States. That's not what I'm saying either, you know. So to one of the questions that was asked, does this idea of religion, how does that make us more political, you know, or affiliate more with a political ideology or not? And, you know, it seems interesting that the more traditional the indigenous communities tend to go, the more apolitical they tend to be. Because we're starting to realize that democracy isn't in our best interest, in anybody's best interest. So we need to do something different.
We need to get ready to wrap up here. But I want to ask you as briefly as you can, but what about governance at the tribal level? Is it affected by the same logic? Or is that different? Yeah, well, yes, because most of them are, you know, tribal elected boards, right? So we have these elected officials, and it's the same type of thing. And it's much different than any type of traditional, you know, indigenous governance. But it's not that it couldn't work. I don't know how that would. I don't know what that would look like. But yes, it does absolutely affect, I think, how we perceive ourselves as a community. Let me, to respect everyone's time, it's about time to wrap up, I'm guessing. Let me ask for a lightning round and ask each of you, starting with Matt, going down the row, to just say 30 seconds of something that you heard from someone else that you want this crowd to remember as they go home. Feel free to take a minute to think about it. I got one. Sorry, so I'll give you a little language teaching, and you can say this with me. A young Wamazin. A young Wamazin. A young Wamazin. So that means, we say that typically like anglicized, that means be careful, right? But what it really means is to walk with intent, right? To live your life with intent. Do things that are intentional, right? Be the best human being that you can. So when we say, when somebody's leaving, you know, a house or whatever, we say, you know, Bamapia, young mama's in, we'll see you later again later, walk with intent, right? It's to be cognizant, to be aware, to be self-aware, to be respectful. So it's a cultural teaching as well as you know, as a greeting, salutations. So a young mama's in. Thank you.
I guess I heard Seth talk about democracy being broken, but in fact, not broken, doing exactly what it's been set out to do, and the need for an alternative. And again, I think here it's important to make a distinction between democracy as a kind of statecraft and the kind of Herrenvolk democracy, which is basically a white supremacist democracy that we've had for the majority of the existence of the United States, and which we have structurally in some ways still to this day, and democratic politics, which is the kind of radical building of a common life across difference in the face of shared challenges. I think there is still hope for radical democratic politics, even if there may not be hope for democracy. So that's my lightning round contribution.
Thank you.
I heard two things from, remember what he said about the survival, that there are in fact a community that we have decided who get to be counted as part of that community and who doesn't. And there is literally a ticking clock on that community. And then your answer about should people say something about what's going on now, the combination between the two is don't be a bystander. You know, everything that you see on TV might be or might look like it's on TV, but it's literally impacting real human beings. Just because you don't see them, and I'm not assuming anyone doesn't see it or is not experiencing, but just because you or someone you know is not part of that group or part of what's happening, doesn't mean it's not an issue that's impacting you. Even if we go back to the basics of at the human level, you know, is it okay to rip families apart? Is it okay to destroy the environment? Is it okay to label a community a certain way because of their religious belief? The answer might be, I don't know what the answer is, but just don't sit and don't talk about religion and politics at your dinner table. That saying we have here in the US is literally destroying us. Talk about it and fight with your family about it.
I think one thing I'm taking away is, Petra, your comments about I think it was 50% of the mosque is pretty split on almost every social issue. And I think about the fact that, you know, I go to a church and I think I hope that churches, I heard this from evangelical pastor recently, that churches are a place where folks of different political persuasions can share a pew still. That may be, as there's more and more churches, maybe not, but there's churches on almost every corner that you can go to and you can self-select, that our religious minority communities don't always get that. And so that those mosques, those synagogues, those temples are probably places more likely where folks who disagree politically can come together with that cross-cutting identity and say, we disagree on this, but we're both Muslims, and we're gonna be here together and pray together. I think there's beauty in that.
Thank you all for participating. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? Thanks to all of you who asked good questions that I didn't get to.
Let's have another round of applause for Neil and all of our panelists. I know Kyle and I, in the planning and preparation for this, were talking about how this could easily turn into a series based on the number of questions we didn't get to. I think we can say yes to that. So I hope we see all of you next a week from today, actually, in this same auditorium, Loosemore Auditorium, for our Cook Leadership Academy graduation. We're going to have a keynote lecture from Wayman Britt. And outside of that, thank you for choosing to spend your evening with us on such a beautiful Thursday in West Michigan.